What if I told you that one of the most beloved fantasy worlds ever created isn't really fantasy at all? That the war-torn, monster-infested, politically fractured nightmare known as the continent in Andrzej Sapkowski's Witcher saga is basically just medieval Central Europe wearing a funny hat and pretending nobody will notice? Because here's the thing. The Holy Roman Empire, that famously chaotic patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, free cities, and bickering princes that dominated Central Europe for nearly 1,000 years, shares so much DNA with the world of Geralt of Rivia that it's almost uncomfortable. We're talking about the same political backstabbing, the same ethnic tensions, the same paranoid scapegoating of outsiders, and the same endless wars fought for reasons that stopped making sense 3 treaties ago. Sapkowski didn't just draw inspiration from medieval Central Europe, he essentially photocopied it, handed it to a griffin, and said fly. So today, we're going deep. We're putting the continent and the Holy Roman Empire side by side, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at a Nilfgaardian invasion the same way again. Alright, let's set the stage. The Holy Roman Empire. You've probably heard the famous quip, usually attributed to Voltaire, that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And honestly, that's one of the most accurate descriptions in all of historiography. Founded traditionally in 800 AD with Charlemagne's coronation and then refounded in a more recognizable form under Otto I in 962, the Holy Roman Empire was this sprawling, loose and deeply dysfunctional confederation of territories stretching across what is now Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic, parts of Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Deutschland, and chunks of Italy and France. It wasn't a unified state. It was more like a very aggressive homeowners association where every member had an army. At its peak, the empire contained over 300 semi-independent territories. You had kingdoms, duchies, margravats, landgraviates, free imperial cities, prince-bishoprics, and territories so small that their ruler could literally see the border from their breakfast table. These entities were constantly jockeying for power, forming alliances, breaking alliances, marrying into each other's families, and occasionally just invading each other because it was a Tuesday. The emperor technically sat at the top, but his actual power depended enormously on his personal holdings, his diplomatic skill, and whether or not the electors who chose him were feeling generous that decade. It was a system designed to prevent any single authority from gaining total control, and in that mission it succeeded spectacularly. The cost was centuries of fragmentation, religious warfare, and a level of political complexity that makes modern European Union negotiations look like a kindergarten sharing circle. Now let's talk about the continent. Andrzej Sapkowski, a Polish author with a deep love of history and a deeply cynical sense of humor, built a world that feels overwhelmingly, unmistakably Central European. And that's not an accident. The northern kingdoms of the continent, places like Redania, Temeria, Caedwen, Aedin, and Kovir, function almost identically to the patchwork of states within the Holy Roman Empire. Each has its own king, its own laws, its own culture, and its own petty grievances against every neighbor. They share a broadly common culture and language. They trade with each other, they intermarry at the royal level, and they spend an absolutely staggering amount of time and resources trying to undermine each other. Sound familiar? Sapkowski rooted his world in Slavic mythology and Polish history specifically, but the political architecture is unmistakably that of the broader Central European medieval experience. The geography reflects this too. Dense forests, river-divided territories, mountain borderlands, and vast stretches of contested frontier. Even the names carry echoes. Temeria evokes Bohemia. Redania carries shades of Poland itself. Nilfgaard, the great southern empire, maps onto everything from the Habsburg domains to the Ottoman threat, depending on which angle you squint from. The continent isn't a generic fantasy land. It's a very specific fantasy land, and that specificity is what makes it resonate so powerfully. Let's get into the political meat of this comparison, because this is where things get really fun. One of the defining features of the Holy Roman Empire was that no one could agree on anything for more than about 15 minutes. The emperor needed the cooperation of the Imperial Diet, which was essentially a parliament of princes, clergy, and city representatives who all had their own agendas. Major decisions required consensus that was nearly impossible to achieve. Meanwhile, powerful families like the Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs, and the Luxembourgs played multi-generational chess games for influence, using marriages, assassinations, and convenient excommunications as tools. In The Witcher, we see the exact same dynamic. The northern kingdoms cannot unify even when facing an existential threat. Nilfgaard is literally marching north with the largest army the continent has ever seen. And what are the northern kings doing? They're spying on each other. They're cutting secret deals with the enemy. King Vizimir of Redania is assassinated. Foltest of Temeria is distracted by personal drama. Henselt of Caedwin is actively seizing territory from his supposed allies while the war is still going on. This is not just inspired by medieval politics. This is medieval politics with the serial numbers barely filed off. The inability of fragmented states to cooperate against a common enemy is one of the great recurring themes of Central European history, from the Mongol invasions of 1241 to the Ottoman sieges of Vienna. Sapkowski understood that the real monster was never the griffin or the striga. It was the committee meeting where everyone agreed to disagree while the enemy crossed the river. Now we need to talk about something darker, because both the Holy Roman Empire and the continent share a deeply uncomfortable feature, and that is the systemic persecution of minorities and outsiders. In the real medieval Holy Roman Empire, Jewish communities faced recurring waves of violence. Pogroms swept through the Rhineland during the Crusades. Jews were blamed for the Black Death in the 14th century, leading to massacres across hundreds of communities. Romani people were marginalized and persecuted. Heretics were burned. Anyone who existed outside the narrow boundaries of accepted Christian society was a potential target. In The Witcher, this is mirrored with brutal clarity through the treatment of elves, dwarves, and other non-human races. The Scoia'tael, elven guerrilla fighters, are driven to extremism by generations of discrimination, land theft, and pogroms. Non-humans are confined to ghettos. They're subject to mob violence. They're scapegoated for economic hardship and military failure. Sapkowski does not flinch from this parallel. He leans into it. And then there are the mages. Sorcerers and sorceresses in the Witcher world occupy a role strikingly similar to that of powerful but distrusted minorities in medieval society. They're useful, even essential, but they're also feared and periodically purged when political winds shift. The witch hunts on the continent directly mirror the real witch trials that swept through the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries when tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed. Sapkowski uses fantasy not to escape from these horrors, but to force us to look directly at them through a lens that somehow makes them even harder to ignore. Finally, let's talk about Nilfgaard, because every fragmented political landscape needs a big, scary unifier knocking on the door. Nilfgaard is the great southern empire, centralized, efficient, militarily dominant, and absolutely relentless in its northward expansion. It absorbs kingdoms, imposes its language and laws, and uses a combination of military conquest and diplomatic coercion to bring the chaotic north to heel. Now, who does that remind you of? Depending on the era, Nilfgaard parallels several real forces. The Habsburg Empire, which gradually consolidated control over much of Central Europe through strategic marriages and military campaigns, is perhaps the closest analogue. The famous Habsburg motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," finds its echo in Emperor Emhyr var Emreis's obsession with dynastic marriage and his pursuit of Ciri as a political asset. But Nilfgaard also carries echoes of the Ottoman Empire, pressing against Europe's southeastern frontier, or even Napoleonic France, sweeping away the old feudal order. The key insight is that Nilfgaard represents what happens when one power decides that fragmentation is a problem to be solved by force. And Sapkowski, ever the cynic, shows us that the cure might be just as terrible as the disease. The northern kingdoms are chaotic and self-destructive, yes, but Nilfgaard's order comes at the price of cultural erasure, authoritarian control, and a different kind of cruelty. This is the same tension that defined Central European history for centuries. freedom through fragmentation or stability through domination, and neither option is particularly kind to the people caught in the middle. So why does any of this matter? Why should we care that a Polish fantasy author built his world on the bones of Central European history? Because it's exactly this grounding in real history that makes the Witcher universe feel so alive, so textured, and so uncomfortably relevant. Generic fantasy gives you good kings and evil dark lords. Sapkowski gives you flawed politicians making cynical calculations while ordinary people suffer. Generic fantasy gives you noble quests. Sapkowski gives you a tired professional exterminator who just wants to get paid but keeps getting dragged into geopolitical nightmares that mirror the actual geopolitical nightmares of medieval Europe. The Witcher works because it tells the truth about human nature and wraps it in a world that, beneath the monsters and magic, operates on the same principles that drove real history. The Holy Roman Empire was messy, violent, contradictory, and fascinating. The continent is all of those things too. Sapkowski just added Kikimoras. And honestly, given what people in the real Middle Ages believed was lurking in their forests, even the monsters aren't that much of a stretch. So the next time you're playing Witcher 3, or reading the books, or watching the show, pay attention to the politics. Pay attention to who gets scapegoated, who benefits from war, and who gets crushed between empires. Because you're not just looking at fantasy. You're looking at 1,000 years of European history wearing a very thin disguise. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives where history and pop culture collide, and drop a comment below telling me which Witcher kingdom you think maps most closely to a real historical state. I have my opinions, but I want to hear yours. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.